Okay, thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me here. That's a great opportunity. Actually, when Sylvain sent me this email with inviting me here, he said something like, it will be great to have you at DepLing rather than the UD workshop, because now finally you will not have to be so immersed in just universal dependencies, and you'll be able to take a broader view from the perspective of the various frameworks you've been working in. And I agreed. I thought, well, okay, that's a great idea. Let's look back at the other things I'd be doing. And I'm afraid I failed because, like, first the topic that I picked up, I find it very interesting one, but it's something I developed interest in only later when I was working in like in multilingual approaches to annotation equals to UD guidelines, looking at UD guidelines and validation. And second, there aren't actually so many frameworks that I could honestly claim to be familiar with. So how do we work with this? Okay, now it works. Yeah, so if I look at it as a timeline, as a computational linguist, I started more on the computational side of things, gradually moving step by step closer towards linguistics. And back in 1995, I found myself working on my master thesis actually at that time and trying to develop a parser for Czech and playing with the first sample of what would eventually become the Prague dependency tree bank. So like Prague family of tree banks based on the functional generative description. That's the first and the main non-UD framework that I will be looking at. Later in 2001, PDT had its first official release. It was already remarkably large, even though not as large as it's today. So other people tried to use it for their models to see how they can possibly do dependency parsing. It had another major release in 2006, the PDT version 2. It was larger, but also it got a second syntactic annotation layer, which is called grammatical. I will get back to it. So essentially here you get sort of two annotation perspectives in one framework. By that time, I already had my PhD and I was looking for new challenges, not just parsing Czech. So I wanted to do something about parsing other languages. And incidentally, in the same year, 2006, there was the first instance of the Connell shared task in multilingual dependency parsing. And I think this is a huge milestone. It has been said here actually already by Joachim and others, not just milestone for myself personally, but I think in general, that's the year when multilingual approaches to at least morphosyntactic analysis, but probably more broadly in NLP that started essentially here. We had 10 data sets for 10 different languages. They're available for parsing experiments. The next year, there were 3 more languages. As many of you know, the main problem here was that every tree bank, every data set had its own view of how you should do dependency analysis of your data. And there was not differences between the languages, but rather between annotation decisions. So that was a problem, especially for what I wanted to do, because I wanted to transfer models, parsing models from one language to another. But there were many other people who viewed it as a problem. So and wanted to do something about it. So eventually, with my colleagues in Prague, we started this project we called HamleDT, which stands for Harmonized Dependency Tree Banks. And we actually, in that time, we wanted to heuristically convert everything that we could get to the Prague style. So that would, from the framework perspective, that would still be like Prague-ish approach to annotation. But actually, these original Cornell shared task data sets, so the input to our effort, gives us an interesting view of what else people may want to do. So I will take that as sort of source for a few other examples that I'll be showing later in the talk of how you could do auxiliaries in other frameworks than PDT or UD. So then, as all of us know, in 2014, the Universal Dependencies project started, not just from scratch, but based on all these previous efforts. Hamlet was one of them, but there was Stanford Dependencies and Google University Banks and other. UD had a second version of the guidelines in 2016 and growing base of data sets. There's one more thing or framework that I want to mention on the UD area of things, even though I can hardly claim to have really worked with it in any sense, but I think it should be mentioned here, and that's SUD. And it should be mentioned here because of its special relation to UD and trying to be convertible back and forth between UD and SUD and trying to provide an alternative to how you could annotate certain constructions. And because I will be talking about auxiliaries, and those are one of the constructions where you see the difference, so I wanted to show a couple of examples, but really I don't have much to say about it because I basically have not done much in it. Now, finally getting back to the upper timeline, PDT, after more than 20 years of existence and several releases that I'm not even showing here, had a major boost recently, again, merging together several other treebanks that my colleagues have released in Prague, and making sure that the annotation is harmonized, like done really the same way across all the treebanks. And also the guidelines were sort of revisited, but it's now much larger. It's a bit different, but much larger. I think it's over 3.5 million words, and it's in UD currently converted as well. So those were the frameworks. Now, I said I will be talking about auxiliaries. I should start by defining what I mean by that, but as you will see, defining what I mean by that is essentially the main line of the whole talk, because it's I think it's not so easy. But anyway, I will start with an example. Here I contrast two very simple clauses, one in Spanish, one in German. And in Spanish, if you say dormirá, that's a morphologically created future tense. So it means he will sleep or she will sleep, as opposed to duerme, which would be the present tense. So there's this tense foot morphological feature which signals that. Now, if you want to say that in German, you essentially cannot do it morphologically. So instead, you have to use an extra function word, werden, wird here, while the schlafen word is the lexical element, that's the sleeping bit. So you have to say wird schlafen, but wird itself is morphologically in its present form. So that's why we have tense pres over there, and we don't have any tense foot in that particular annotation, because it's auxiliary and because that's how usually auxiliaries are annotated in UD. So this is the trees here are taken from UD. Now, if you wonder what we could possibly do with showing the future feature over that German tree, then stay tuned for Lenka Kripnerova's talk later in the session, because she will show you what we did in that direction. Okay, so that was an example. Now, the first step at a definition, vague one. So auxiliary is a word that accompanies the verb, or more generally as part of the predicate. I'm thinking here about copulas, which could be the only verbal element in the predicate. And it contributes grammatical features as opposed to the lexical meaning, such as tense, aspect, voice, others. And it's possibly an open-ended set. The auxiliary itself may look like a verb. So that's why in many languages we speak about auxiliary verbs, but not necessarily. Because also in many languages, it's not clear what it means looking like a verb. If you don't have verbal morphology, so then what else would tell you? So it could be an uninflected particle. still with the same grammatical function of, let's say, telling this is past or future or perfect. Now, okay, to give you a quick summary of what I hinted at, we have something I would call ordinary auxiliary, for the lack of better term. And then we have copula as something that some people would believe is auxiliary. UD would treat it as auxiliary. And then modal verbs, which I didn't mention yet, but we will see later in the talk that they are a special group, sometimes auxiliaries, sometimes not. So now the questions about these, this definition, there are many. So first I said it's a word. What is a word? That has been also discussed here already and at other places. That's not so easy to define exactly. What is a verb? Seems clear, but it's not necessarily clear. Is a participle, is it a verb or adjective or sometimes one, sometimes the other? Tense, aspect, voice. What are these features? What is aspect? So again, like if you look at the grammatical description of a language, maybe it will tell you this language has perfective aspect, imperfective, maybe habitual or progressive, to list some of them. But if you try more broadly to define aspect, so, well, to begin doing something, to end doing something is also some kind of aspectual view of that event. And we have these phase verbs, beginning, starting, ending, terminating. Are they auxiliaries because of that? Not necessarily, at least not like depending on what your traditional view of the auxiliaries in that language is. What about other features? What about negation? Should be included? What about modality? And that's the first time where I like think of modal verbs. In English, at least in UD, modal verbs will be auxiliaries. In other languages, not necessarily. Finally, as I introduced uninflected, non-verbal auxiliaries, it opens door for another set of questions. What about adverbs? Or more broadly, and if I say in a language, not necessarily English, I do this tomorrow. Tomorrow brings the notion of future, even if like more narrowly limited. So does it mean that tomorrow is an auxiliary? Probably all of you would say no. But again, the question is, how do we know? So many questions, not so many good answers. And I think the main reason why we have to ask these questions is that we need some kind of cross-linguistically comparable notion of auxiliary if we want to use the annotated data for comparison. If we are just looking at one language, maybe we are just fine with using some kind of traditional description, which typically will enumerate your auxiliaries, sometimes even with like conditions or question marks that this could be an auxiliary, but it has some special properties, so on. And that's what often happens. If I try to look at individual languages and see what is the official definition or prevailing definition of auxiliary there, I will often just see a list of words, but not necessarily a clear criteria why these words and not the others. So the problem with the tradition is that once I want to look at the neighbor's tradition, it might be quite different, and then the comparison will fail. Okay, so that's the main problem that I'm going to look at in the rest of the talk. Now, we should also ask, does it matter at all? Do we have to treat auxiliaries as something special? Because if we don't, then we don't have to define them. But probably we do, because people do that all over the place. So it seems like at least like if I take the majority vote, then people would agree that in many languages auxiliaries are important. They often have special type of annotation in treebanks. And that alone, if we work with those treebanks, that alone is important, because if we use the data and we want to compare them, then we need to know how the auxiliaries are defined there. But they're usually treated in a special way for good reasons, because they are special. Again, not necessarily in all languages, but maybe those languages don't have auxiliaries. So there are often special rules for positioning auxiliaries, and that's what typologists like to study. Even if the auxiliary is verb-like, it may have different distribution from normal verbs. Even actually, there are words that can act as both either normal verb or auxiliary in different contexts. And if there is verb-specific morphology, then again, there might be forms that are only used with auxiliaries, even though the main part of the paradigm will be the same. And there might be forms that are not used with auxiliaries, but with lexical verbs. And finally, if you look at it semantically, then the main question we would probably ask is that one event or two? If it's two events, then for two verbs, then you probably have something like two clauses and you don't want to speak about auxiliaries. If it's one event, it could be an auxiliary, but not necessarily. That's like not sufficient condition because it could be a compound or something similar. So I said it's important for typology and contrastive studies and etc. Originally, I wanted to have a larger part of the talk about this, but then I realized I really will not have time for all of that. So I have just one slide showing a plot from an article which we had with Joachim and Marie. It was issued. It was published last year actually, but we worked on it long ago. So that's the plot is from an older version of UD, and I'm pretty sure you can't read all the language codes on the left of that, but the bars show the proportion of the relative frequency of auxiliaries in that language, and the colors show you the official like classification of the language, language family, and the genus, so that you can compare it. And we saw some interesting patterns there, but also, quite importantly, we believe that at least some of the patterns were not showing you real differences between languages, but were rather artifacts of the annotation, how people decided to do to apply the auxiliary tag in that particular language. So without going more into details of this study, I would say that really, if you have a different definition of auxiliary, you will get different results in a contrastive study. So that it really matters. Okay, so that was the first of three parts of the talk, like introduction to the problem. Now, the middle part will be the one where I will try to show tree diagrams from various frameworks. So this is the part which should sort of reflect Silvan's wish. And I will show you in these frameworks how auxiliaries are annotated and that it's not always the same thing, without trying to argue in favor of any of the approaches. Because I think like we have had these discussions at DepLing already 10 years ago, and I believe each framework has its own advantages and its own lovers. So let's just make this more or less an exhibition of or a sample of what you could find. So I start with Prague dependency tree bank, and I try to have some like different color styles for the different frameworks so that it's easily recognizable. And as I said, there are two layers. One of them is called A layer or analytical, which you can translate as surface syntax roughly. And maybe I should have a Czech example because it was developed for Czech. I will have one later, but I started with an English one. Monica will give me the book on Monday, and the highlighted word is the auxiliary will here. And this is how it would be annotated in the A layer of PDT. So the main or the lexical verb give would be the head here, and the auxiliary will be its dependent with the label aux_v on the dependency arc. Now, if we look at the second layer, the deep syntactic or tectogrammatical layer, things become more interesting because now not only the auxiliary will be like a second-class citizen sort of attached to the main verb, it will disappear completely, or not completely because like it's a data set, we still have it somewhere, but it will not have its own node in the tree structure. Rather, it will become some kind of feature of the main verb, and it will be the information will be transferred into features which are called grammar themes in the T layer, and you can see they look mostly like morphological features, but they are not morphological anymore because they comprise information from both the auxiliary and the main verb. So there's tense and aspect with some values which are defined in the documentation. I have one more slide contrasting the two layers in one diagram. And then I also have a slide where I have UD annotation on top and the Prague A layer under the sentence. And you can see that it's actually pretty close. It's very similar. As far as auxiliaries are concerned, the only difference is in the label of the arc. And the only real difference in the tree structure is in the prepositional phrase over there, but that's not auxiliary, so let's not talk about it anymore. Now, the Czech example taken really from, I think from even the manual. So, nebudu o tom mluvit means I will not talk about it. And here we see again that the auxiliary is a separate node attached to the main verb on the analytical layer, but it's not a node of the structure in the T layer. But it also shows that the T layer can give you additional nodes, generated nodes. We say that are there for other to represent other phenomena. So here the auxiliary also represents negation, but because it would disappear, and negation does not necessarily have to be on the auxiliary, it can be elsewhere as well. So it has its own node to be signaled in the deep structure. And also there are many nodes generated for the missing subjects or valency license arguments. Now, that was what I called ordinary auxiliary example in the introduction. What about modal verbs? In Czech, modal verbs are not auxiliaries. Now I'm just saying that as a claim without much explanation, and probably I should not say in Czech, because if we look carefully, we would find authors who would say, well, they are like auxiliaries in some respects and like something else in other respects. But the Prague dependency tree bank at the A layer will not treat them as auxiliaries. Consequently, in the UD annotation up there, I don't treat them as auxiliaries either, because I just converted the Czech tree bank to UD automatically. But we had some discussions in 2014 about what I should do with auxiliaries or with modal verbs there, and this was the result. So tohle rodiče musí vědět. Parents must know this in English. UD annotation will use the XComp relation, and in the original PDT annotation, there will be just obj. Like object. Objects, nominal objects will have the same label. The label set is not so diversified there. Now, again, when we look at the T layer, it's actually interesting because it is treated like some kind of auxiliary or function word at the T layer. It does disappear, just as the future auxiliary would disappear. So musí has not a node there. Consequently, the main verb vědět now becomes the head of the sentence. And it will have some grammar themes, which I'm not showing here, which will have the modality there. If we take the English equivalent of that sentence, and parents must know this. Now, in English, and I will have something about it later on another slide, must is an auxiliary, and it can be shown based on syntactic tests. So it is an auxiliary in UD. That's the annotation above the sentence. I tried to show you what it would look like in PDT, but it's actually difficult because I can't really take it from the corpus. We do have some English data in the parallel tree bank, Czech English tree bank, but the analytical layer there has not been done manually. So it has been converted by some heuristic rules from the original Penn tree bank constituent annotation, and it's not reliable. So what I found there is that modal verbs will be attached to the main verb as ADV, adverbial. I'm not sure how it made its way there. I would say if we have AUXV as an option, it should be there, but it's not what you find in data. Now, this is one of the 2 or 3 slides I have with SUD. So SUD is below the sentence here, because I said SUD has different view of what you do with some, especially function words. So auxiliaries are function words, so that's what you get for the sentence, and parents must know this. There is in UD, you would have aux going from no to must. In SUD, you would have comp aux going from must to no. So must will be the head, and comps, I believe, stands for complement, but it has to be subtyped so that you can convert back and forth between UD and SUD and not lose the information. There will be other, there is comp object, the next one, know this. So that's how you know that it's a different type of complement. Now, I also searched and grew to see what the Czech sentence would have there. And it will have comp opt because we had xcomp in the UD annotation, and the SUD was created by automatically converting from UD. So there was not really a human annotator of SUD for Czech who would decide whether this is correct or not. But this is what you get. Interestingly, even though the UD decisions are typically guided by the wish to have better parallelism across languages, in this particular case, in Czech, you get better parallelism in SUD than in UD. Because if I go back, you have a dependency from must to know with comp aux. Here in Czech, you get from must to know with comp opt. So only the subtype differs. Otherwise, the tree is much more parallel between Czech and English in this particular case. Not that it's in general, but you can see that sometimes just our wishes are not fulfilled in UD. Now, the few examples I have from the other frameworks. So the first one is from an Italian treebank. Many of these examples are sentences that you would find in UD and SUD as well, because those are treebanks that were later converted to UD and SUD, but the annotation might be different. So my examples show the annotation that I saw in the Cornell shared task data sets that we took as input for Hamlet. So in this case, ha dovuto essere sgomberata, meaning a room had to be evacuated. And you can see that they essentially, like in UD, the auxiliaries are descendants of the lexical verb, but not exactly as in UD, because the UD annotation is below the sentence. So there you would have each of the auxiliaries attached directly to the main verb, while there is more structure in the original Italian annotation. And also you can see that there's this modal label which distinguishes modal verbs from other auxiliaries, although they are also treated as dependents. I also have SUD annotation of this sentence, so you can see that here you will get essentially a chain of relations from ha to dovuto to essere to sgomberata. My second example from this area is from the Alpino treebank of Dutch. The highlighted words again are the auxiliaries / verbs. So kan worden vastgesteld, sorry for my pronunciation, meaning can be determined. Here again, we have a chain already in the original annotation. So it goes from kan to worden to vastgesteld. But interestingly, many other things are attached to the main verb, which creates a lot of non-projectivities here. And again, you have the UD annotation corresponding down there. Then I have a Portuguese example from the Bosque treebank. Poderá vir a ser means can come to be. So first, like one interesting point is that here finally I have copula ser as an auxiliary of its own. So ser uma hipótese meaning be a hypothesis. There is a modal poderá. The labels of the arcs are I think a bit reversed. I'm not sure because I didn't read the annotation manual there, but I believe aux says that vir is aux, not that poderá is aux. But the most interesting point why I'm showing is here is that there is this some kind of subordinator or a preposition between vir and ser, which I will claim later for me would be a signal that maybe I want to have two clauses rather than an auxiliary. But I can see why it was annotated this way, because like traditionally in many of these languages, a and de would be just elements that you use with something you call auxiliary traditionally. And my final example from this set is from Spanish. Here we don't even have something I would want to call auxiliary, but nevertheless, it is something that could at least enter the debate, and that's the reflexive set. Because like originally it's a reflexive element used for reflexive arguments of verbs, but in many Romance, Slavic, and also some Germanic languages, it has grammaticalized and provided other functions like the passive. So here you can see it is actually annotated in the original tree as passive. Sephican. So Sephican was comitios, meaning literally the elections fix themselves. But it should be translated like a passive until the elections are fixed. So you could say that if voice, if contributing the grammatical feature of voice is a sign of auxiliary, and if it doesn't have to be verb-like, then well, sec could be an auxiliary in this case. Okay, so those were the examples how we annotate, and then in the last part of my talk, I'm returning to the question, what are they? How can we possibly improve the definition to be able to cross-linguistically end up with a set which is roughly comparable? So I will start with English, not just because everyone knows English, but also because as far as I was able to find out, the tests that I know for English are much better or better defined or with more usable than the ones I was able to find for the other languages. So, and these tests, unlike the other I will be showing, are really taken from an authoritative source. That's the Huddleston-Pullum grammar. There are more tests than just these two, but I think these are informative enough. And essentially, it's they are based on syntax and what's grammatical, whatnot. So in English, if you form a question, you have to invert the word order if you have an auxiliary there, but it's not enough if there's just the main verb. So you can eat meat, can is an auxiliary. You just say, can you eat meat? And that's a question. You have eaten meat. Have you eaten meat? You reverse the order, you have a question. If I say you want to eat meat, I cannot say, won't you eat meat? Or at least that's what they taught me in English classes. Whenever I talk about English, someone raises his hand and says, well, in some dialects you can. So with that in mind, I think you cannot say that in the mainstream English. So you have to introduce an auxiliary do. Do you want to eat meat? And that's the test that will tell you if you have to do that, then the original verb was not an auxiliary. Similarly, in negation, you can eat meat, you cannot eat meat. That's simple. You have eaten meat, you have not eaten meat, but I cannot say you want not eat meat. I have to say you don't want to eat meat. So again, I have to introduce do as an auxiliary because there was no auxiliary before. So this is something you can apply, I think, quite easily if you understand English and if you know what sounds grammatical, what not. And I'm not actually aware of other language that would have tests like that. I'm not absolutely saying that there are no such languages. I am quite believe that there are. I just don't know those languages. But in the other European languages, we have freer word order. I found it quite difficult because if you just take these tests, you cannot use them in, let's say, German. That will not work. But maybe for some languages, you can find other tests which are similarly rigorous, but use other properties of that other language. I found one other thing, which I believe, and that's what I mentioned already in the Spanish example before. In quite a few languages, when you combine two verbs, and often it's the case that one of the verb will be traditionally called auxiliary or semi-auxiliary, then if you have to introduce some kind of element which looks like a subordinator, then, as I said before, I would not call it auxiliary. I would rather say we have two clauses, even if it's actually semantically one event. So here's again a Spanish example, again a future actually, but this time not morphological future, but rather an analytical one. Voy a comer el chocolate. I'm going to eat the chocolate. By the way, I'm going to in English, am is an auxiliary, but going is not, because of the same test. So I would not say this is auxiliary. That's why in UD, the annotation will be with xcomp. Interestingly, applying these tests will not necessarily give you matching set of auxiliaries in neighboring languages. So if I give you the same example in Portuguese, they don't have the A there. You just say vou comer o chocolate. That means it could be an auxiliary in Portuguese. And I actually checked one of the Portuguese treebanks, and I found out that this vou or ir, to go, to do something, really is annotated as auxiliary there. But I don't think that's a disadvantage necessarily, because now we are really highlighting differences between the languages. So that's what we probably wanted to do when we comparing. Getting back to Czech and Prague dependency treebank, obviously, I also wanted to know how do we in Prague define the auxiliary for the aux-v annotation. Unfortunately, but maybe not surprisingly, when I consulted the manual for the annotators, it just says that it just lists the forms that are created using an auxiliary, and the auxiliary is always beat, the verb to be. So that's just stated there. It's based on the Czech grammatical tradition. Again, it's not saying that it's the only possible view of Czech, and I've seen other descriptions which would say, well, there are other verbs that could be treated as auxiliaries if you take those and those criteria. And that would be the comparatively sound approach, but it would not necessarily give you the same set, and they wanted to have annotation, which would be primarily good for Czech. The manual actually says that you should distinguish compound verb form from compound verbal predicate, however similar it sounds. And the second one is includes verbs with modal verbs or with phrase verbs. So they explicitly say that that's not the same thing, and it should not be annotated the same way, at least on the A layer. Now, when I tried, so this is the manual. When I tried to think about how I could define it in a more portable way and consulting the other sources which would try to define it with some tests, there's at least one test which works for Czech and should work in some other languages, but again, probably not in all, because it sort of relates to the question whether we have one event or two, is that there can be only one negation if you have an auxiliary plus the main verb compound. So, sorry, I shouldn't say compound here. So I didn't come, já jsem nepřišel, jsem is the auxiliary. That's the correct negation, but I cannot say já nejsem přišel. People speaking Croatian, or I think Slovene as well, here will probably say, okay, we put the negation on the auxiliary and not on the main verb, but again, probably not on both. And you definitely cannot say já nejsem nepřišel. While for modal verbs, it is actually possible, even if not so frequent. So můžu přijít, I can come, nemůžu přijít, I cannot come, můžu nepřijít, I may not come. That's something you can plausibly say, it's not ungrammatical. And you also can say nemůžu nepřijít, I cannot not come. I don't know, that's probably not correct English way of saying it, but that's roughly what the Czech part say. So that's what makes modals different, at least this test. Moving on, I also, because Czech is not the only language for which Prague-style treebanks have been created, so we have created a few others in Prague, and other people modeled their treebanks after the Prague one. So I consulted 4 of them. Slovak and Croatian was easy because it was really modeled so closely after Czech that there are not almost no differences, except for Croatian, where there are actually 2 treebanks, sets and hops. And in the second one, I saw that they would use the aux-v label, but they would also include a negative particle not as an auxiliary attached that way. Not in sets and not in Czech, even though in Czech the negation would typically be morphological. I also looked at Lithuanian, the Auxnis treebank, and the Prague Arabic treebank, but in both of them, because they knew that the original annotation guidelines of PDT were for Czech, so they developed their guidelines similar to the ones of Czech, and they refer to the Czech annotation guidelines, but they, whenever the language is different, they do something different. So there are some aux-like things. In Arabic, for instance, you would have the future tense particle sa attached as some kind of aux-m, which includes other particles. So that's not so much comparable. Now, finally, in UD, There is a definition as well in documentation. It's long. I have cited here, but I will not read it all. Essentially tries to say what I said in the beginning, listing the various possibilities which you should consider when defining what is an auxiliary, but then you have to find tests in each language separately. Okay, so finally, what do we do in UD? When I realized when working on validation rules for UD that people have very different opinions on what should be an auxiliary, including things like originally the Spanish treebanks. Some of them had, I think, more than 50 different auxiliaries, half of them copulas. And then the Portuguese treebank would have also many auxiliaries, but different ones. So I thought, well, maybe we should do something about it. We should at least like force people to think about it if we cannot make hard rules that they cannot cross. And I developed this system for registering the auxiliaries with the validator. And there's also a form which forces you to document what is the function of your auxiliary. And so like for Slovenian, this would be the upper part of the page, but then you would see what has been already defined for the other languages. And so that makes you think you don't necessarily have to have the same set of auxiliaries, but at least you see what they have already defined, and you can think whether you believe you are different or not. So my final few slides are looking at some statistics from this system versus the actual data. So I looked at the treebanks for frequencies. I skipped some of them because they didn't have text or lemmas, but I still have a decent selection of 165 languages. And 12 of them did not have any documented auxiliaries, which could mean they don't have auxiliaries because they have lemmas and they don't have auxiliaries in the data set. So maybe the language has them in the view of some of you, but it wasn't annotated that way. 19 of them have auxiliaries, but only documented as a copula, which I realized does not necessarily mean that the auxiliary cannot have other functions, because the validator actually does not require people to use it only as copula if they set it's only a copula. Maybe we should change that. And I have a few plots, not all 160 languages, but if you are interested in your language, then get to me later. So this is what you get in English. The blue part of the bar is the proportion, how many times it was actually used as auxiliary. The red one is a copula usage. So we typically should see this at only one or a few bars. And the light brown bar is how many times it was a normal verb. And the highlighted there down here means that it was defined as a possible auxiliary, but never used as such. If you look at German, again, tun has been defined, but never used as auxiliary. Some of them are much more frequent than the others. And for instance, sein has also the black part up there because the lemma could also be possessive his. So that's why we also get some other usages. It could also look like this. Slavic languages are usually easy. And I have a few Romance languages just to compare, not so much to discuss here. Maybe in the discussion we can ask the people responsible what were their tests for that. So French has just 5 auxiliaries in the treebanks. Spanish has a few more. Galician has even more. And many of these have cognates which were originally also annotated as auxiliaries in Spanish, but we got rid of them. In contrast, the Galician team insisted that they are auxiliaries. And again, I don't know whether like they use different tests or same test and different results. Finally, I also wanted to throw in an example of something non-Indo-European, but I don't have much to comment on here. So this is Indonesian, and that brings me to the summary. So I have claimed, and I think shown, that auxiliaries are difficult to define cross-linguistically. Often modal verbs are a special group which needs special attention. Some languages might have syntactic tests, while in other languages it might be more difficult. And I claim that the comparing sets across languages, as we try to enforce in UD, is useful, but the cognates, like in Spanish and Portuguese, are not necessarily guaranteed to work the same way. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. We have time for questions, comments, discussion. There are microphones being, Tim, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A great talk, very understandable. My question concerns the problem for UD in this area, at least as I see it. On an SUD analysis, the auxiliaries, whether they are deemed auxiliaries or not, will be positioned above the content verb. And so the hierarchy of structure is going to be consistent regardless of whether or not your function verb that you have is deemed an auxiliary or not. So on the SUD type of approach, the difficulties that you pose here are reduced as I see it because the hierarchy of structure will be consistent regardless of whether or not that function verb is an auxiliary. So I'd just like to get your view on that, your commentary on that.
Well, my comment is like that's very true. You get one thing consistent. In UD we try to get other thing consistent. So like in UD we try to make the auxiliaries look like more like features, so that morphology in one language and auxiliaries in other language or in other construction of that language are closer to each other. But the price is that we get a different structure. Now, it's not exactly, I think it's not exactly always as you said, because what I mostly ignored in my examples is that you could also have compounds. And if like you have a compound predicate with multiple verbs, and I'm now thinking of things like serial verb constructions in languages which I don't speak, so I can't comment much on that. But I don't think necessarily you would have the same structure depending on whether you say it's an auxiliary or a compound member or something else.
Amir.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That was a really great talk, and I really enjoyed the survey, especially for European languages. One brief comment is that I think we should also look at other types of languages, like in agglutinative languages, for example. Really, the slot is what determines it. Like you say, the tests are difficult, but in some languages, it's very deterministic based on the morphology. And just another quick comment or something I found. I really like the idea that double negation should make it impossible for something to be an auxiliary because you have one event, you can only negate once. But I had this lingering suspicion that you could find examples, and so I had a quick look. And unfortunately, even for English, it's quite rare, but you can find examples like here I have one. She did not want to, but at the same time, she did not want to, if you see what I mean. So unfortunately, there are always exceptions, but still a great test. Best potential I've heard for a universal test.
You're right on both accounts. So first, like looking at other languages, I very much realize that this is a weakness of this talk, but that would take me a lot more effort because I am much less knowledgeable about the non-Indo-European languages. I thought I already have enough on my plate with this. The second one, yes, I'm actually aware that there are exceptions even in Czech. I took the test. It's not something I made up. I found it in one Czech author has said in a survey that negation could be a good test, but he said that for future in Czech will be sort of similar to English. Instead of the auxiliary will, there will be one form of the beat to be, and then an infinitive. And in theory, you should not put negation on the infinitive. It should always be on the auxiliary, but he actually found counterexamples, not too many, but in the Czech national corpus. So I will always disagree would be said as negation. The normal, I will always not agree. So that's the counterexample he found.
So I now have Erhard, then Chris, and please try to keep it short because we're running out of time. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what I would like to raise is a sort of methodological question, and that is, I think it's very, very useful to cleanly separate syntactic and semantic considerations. I think there's a model paper for this, and I think up to this day, still the best descriptive account of English auxiliaries. That's a paper by Jeff Pullum and Deirdre Wilson with the telling title, Autonomous Syntax and the Analysis of Auxiliaries. The reason it was had that heading was that there was a competing, I'm sorry, I can't do this too shortly. There was a competing analysis in so-called generative semantics that basically took auxiliaries as a kind of semantic object that then somehow was going to be placed in syntax. And there were huge fights in the generative framework at the time. So I think it's important to kind of keep distributional evidence, in other words, syntactic evidence, apart from semantic consideration. I just want to give one quick example here.
No.
Okay,
I will add one comment on your comment.
I'm very worried.
Yeah.
This is my worry. If we are not methodologically clear on what to do,
I think you've made your point. Would you like to comment on that, Dan? Please.
I think I just thank you because that's for
can I just
long discussion maybe.
add one sentence? The point is, I would be very unhappy if people sort of go like this and say, well, modal verbs, we always want to treat as
I think you've made
blah,
that
blah,
point clearly already. Thank you. Yeah, please, Dan.
Yeah, I would be unhappy as well, but we try to make them think about it.
Chris.
This is a follow-up from Tim's question. It was interesting that in the Prague treebank analytical layer for English, you didn't treat the auxiliaries as heads, despite some of the argumentation that you showed later in the talk of the kind of evidence from English syntax discussed by Paul and Huddleston. Was that a carefully thought through decision, or did you sort of just loosely copy check?
You mean in the Prague style annotation of English?
The Prague analytical layer in particular.
Yeah, that's I sort of not only copy check, but I looked at the annotation of the parallel treebank we have. That's why I showed the adverbial there /auxv, and I said, well, if we model it after check, it should be auxv, but I didn't discuss that we should change the structures.
All right, we have 2 more papers in this session, so we'll have to stop there. Let's thank them one more time.